Okay, so we're recording now. So, good evening, everybody. This is the Salesforce Dublin Developer Group. My name is Barry Hughes. I think everyone here has probably met me or heard of me at some stage here. So this is our last event of the year that we've scheduled. It was really good to get back. I know Jurgen is on the call. He can push me back to doing this stuff. We had 4 events in the last few months. But this evening, I'm delighted to have Paul Battisson to talk to us this evening all about Apex. I met Paul quite a number of times at different events. I think we even had dinner once at Dreamforce, Paul, and a good chat.
Have.
So it's really good to have. One of the people I really wanted to get to talk to the group, and when he published a book this year, I'll tell you that in a second. I gave him a shout, and it was great to have him along. We've no events currently planned, although I have a few in mind that I want to do next year. We're going to update everyone hopefully in the next month about some events at the start of the year. But the last 2 events that we had, Inez Garcia did a virtual event talking about Agile. So her recording is there. It's also, if you look on YouTube for Dublin Salesforce Developer Group, you'll find it. Really good hour virtual meetup. And then Alba Riva was with us last month to talk about Salesforce functions. Her slide deck is now available on that event page. So if you go to that event page on our Trailblazer group, community group, it'll be there. We are getting our Trailblazer group fully set up. So eventually you'll be able to join it. If you go on the groups, you can join it anyway, but it'll be searchable. So a few things are in train for that. And also we do a lot of our announcements on Twitter still. So our Twitter handle is Dublin_SF_devs. If anyone is able to contact me there. If you are interested in talking at an event, please reach out to me on the Twitter handle or on the community group. And I know I've talked to a few people already about doing the next session, which I think we're going to do something on flows starting the year. So a couple of people have already volunteered for that. If you're interested, please let me know. So this evening, as I said, we have Paul Battisson, who's the COO, not the CTO, COO of Cloud Galacticos. He's also a published author. His book on learning Salesforce development was only released in August. He also have another book, Paul, on mastering Apex development. I believe that was out a couple of years ago. So
Yes.
Go to Amazon, look for Paul's books. Well worth a read. I actually have both of them. Really worth a read. So I'll say thank you now, and I'll hand over to Paul.
Super. Thank you, Barry. I'm glad you can remember that lovely dinner we had in San Francisco. So, which was so long ago now as well, given everything that's happened in the meantime.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to developer groups. As I've done, as Barry mentioned, he and I have kind of met up at a lot of things like Dreamforce and London's Calling and all the different dreaming events and world tours and things. And I always like developer groups because they're a bit more intimate and friendly. And as much as this is recorded, we can talk a little bit more openly and freely as well. And there's not 60 of us kind of trying to corner each other at a stage afterwards or dashing to another event. So this evening, we're going to go through just a bit of a discussion on Apex because, when Barry invited me, I was thinking, well, what can I go through? And I did think about showing you some code or talking through some coding. I thought about going through some stuff that is just new or think about, but there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of things like that. So what I wanted to do was something a bit different that I've not really done before formally, and that might be just, I thought, interesting, which is just a discussion about Apex. So I'll go through the agenda in a minute, but really just something that talks about why Apex is as it is. Because so I've been working with Salesforce. We just move on to the next slide so we can see. That's another terrible picture of me. I've been working with Salesforce now for about 13 years. My first role and interaction with the platform was as a developer for Financial Force. So I started working with Salesforce by being a Financial Force accounting developer. My first release of Salesforce was they were getting rid of what was called Classic UI then, which I think, I'm going to say probably Barry's only old enough to remember, and I apologize for saying that about Barry as well. but yeah, they had this wonderful new thing called the Aloha interface, which is when everything was Hawaiian themed. And it was what we now refer to as Classic. That had just been rolled out, and there was this sexy new product called Chatter that had been announced, which was going to take the world by storm. So it's a long, long time ago. So it's quite funny seeing things come through. But my background is primarily technical. So although I am the COO at Cloud Galacticos and spend most of my my time dealing with things such as sales and marketing and all of those things that we talk to our clients about, that our clients like to make sure they're doing, I have the job of making sure that we actually do. And but as I say, my background primarily technical. I've been a developer, a senior developer. I've managed products on the platform. Was an architect for a period as well. So done a number of things. I have been an MVP for 9 years. Was one of the Force.com MVPs back when it was known as that as the platform, and have been lucky enough to stay on since. I have a bunch of Salesforce certs, again, old enough that a number of them, I think it says 23 on my actual Trailblazer profile, but 3 of them no longer exist, so they don't count anymore, which is a bit annoying. If you want to find me everywhere, I'm P. Battisson. I'm very simple and consistent, if nothing else, in my branding. And there's my surname is unique enough that there's not many of me out there. And as Barry mentioned, I've written a couple of books. My COVID pastime was sitting down and writing. I recommend, if you do want to write one book, let alone 2 books, that you do it during a global pandemic when you have no choice but to stay indoors and deadlines are easy to meet. Because I also recommend doing it. So I don't have any children or anything like that, no pets, nothing. So it was just me and my partner. And it meant that she had a lovely, peaceful lockdown whilst I was sat in a room scribing away. So the book's down there. For those that are interested, Learning Salesforce Development with Apex is for new beginners who want to learn Apex. If you've not written any Apex code in your life, it's there to help you get up and running, and help you kind of understand how that works together. The Mastering Apex book is more for those that have been working with Apex for a while and want to go through a bit more detail, and covers things like asynchronous stuff and performance. And I also have a testing course there as well, called Astronomical Apex Testing, and there is a YouTube channel somewhere. So with that noise and nonsense about me out of the way, tonight, what we're going to talk about is, first of all, what is Apex? And I think that there's a bunch of people that think they probably know what Apex is, but do we really know what Apex is? Because that's a key question to help us understand the second part, which is, why does Apex even exist? I've read more Stack Overflow threads than I care to remember about why did Salesforce not just use Java? Why did Salesforce not do everything as JavaScript? Why aren't we using Rust? Or whatever the flavor of the month might be at the time. And there'll always be some esoteric person that wants it to be done in C. Why does Apex exist? Why did they actually write Apex to start off with? Why is Apex amazing? What are 5 things you should really love about it? And I think, just as a quick show of sort of hands, and I'm aware that we can do a hands up here. Who here was a programmer in another language before they started working with Apex? Who here is programmed in something like C or something else? We've got Pavel, we've got Barry, I saw waving, Sally. Okay, so we've got about 3 or 4 of them. So predominantly people here who are using Apex, or I suppose there's another quick question as a hands up. Who here actually doesn't write Apex, or doesn't, who here is kind of more of an admin and is really listening in just for their own interest? Okay, Lucas and Mike, cool. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this, and Jorgen, so hopefully by the end of this, I'll convince you that you should learn Apex as well, which is what what we'll try and do. So if you've not worked with another language before, there's a bunch of things that Salesforce does and Apex does that you don't realize are really actually amazing, that it does it for you for free, and you'll be very glad you don't have to sit there figuring out how to use them. Equally though, however, Apex has some things that suck about it, so we'll talk about those. We'll talk about why you should learn Apex, aside from the fact that, I think I do mention that it's a growing skill in a growing area of the industry, but why else should you learn it? And then I just want to wrap up with kind of where I think the Apex language might go. I have no insider information. I do not have any access to any secret safe harbor statement information that you all don't have access to. This is merely just going to be Paul's conjecturing and pontificating around where he thinks it is based upon kind of industry trends and things going on. So with that, let's start off with what is Apex. So the Apex Developer Guide has this wonderful, wonderful definition in there. Literally, I think that's the second page in the Developer Guide of what and it says, Apex is a strongly typed, object-oriented programming language that allows developers to blah, 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 right? If you've opened the Apex Developer Guide, you've seen this, but what I want to do is just highlight a few different things in here that are really, really going to get us to the heart of what Apex is. So the first one is that it is object-oriented, okay? Now that's a big thing. Again, there's probably those who have worked with other languages and maybe old enough might remember non-object-oriented languages being the de rigueur, and you actually having this new thing called OOP that was coming out and became very popular. So an object-oriented language works with the idea of objects, works with the idea of classes, and it's really about coming up with the idea of different domains and taking those domains and how we think about them and putting them in a structure that is more human understandable. Other programming languages such as C, is a non-object oriented language. It starts at the top and it runs down to the bottom, and in the middle you have to tell it where to go. Okay, and that's how things like C or BASIC. If anyone else is old enough to have used a BBC microcomputer or something like that, I think Barry's probably the only other poor person on here that's ever sat down with a magazine and type things out. Yeah, you would start at the top and it would work down the instructions one by one, and eventually you would tell it, actually, if this is true, go to this line, and then it would re-loop itself and all these things. Object-oriented stuff makes it easy for us to go, okay, let's have the idea of a dog, of a ball, of a circle, of a car, of an account, or whatever. The second thing that I think is really important to know about Apex is that it is strongly typed. So what does that mean? It means that it cares. Okay. Now, a weakly typed language like JavaScript will allow you to do all sorts of stupid things, and you'll be able to write some syntax that allows you to add together a string, so like the word Paul, and a number like the word 12, and probably do a division symbol in there and divide it by a constant like pi, and it will put out something at the end. It will probably be useless and not very helpful, but it will do it for you. Okay, it doesn't care what the data is. Salesforce and Apex in particular, it does. So when you're saying to it, this is a date, it needs to be a date. When you're saying to it, it's a string, it needs to be a string. And that's going to be very important when we start to think about how we're working later on with the database. It works on the Salesforce servers. It doesn't work anywhere else. Okay, you can't run Apex anywhere else except on Salesforce's servers. And this is a real bone of contention with a lot of people, because if you could run Salesforce Apex code locally, your tests would run a hell of a lot quicker. You'd be able to have all sorts of grammar and parsing systems. You'd be able to build languages on top of it because you understand how that was working. You'd be able to effectively deploy Salesforce to your own server. And if you wanted it to run faster, you could have it run faster effectively. But it only runs on Salesforce servers. Okay, and that's a really key thing for everyone to remember, because that puts in restraints. And that's really the core of the multi-tenant system here, is that Apex is designed to allow you to use the Salesforce server power. It also works with the API. Now, Salesforce were one of the first companies to really be API driven. And when I say that, it's really hard to think about what that was like back when they first started doing it. Because most of us, when we think about APIs today, are thinking about REST APIs. Now, the paper around the REST framework, I don't think it was written until 2005. Someone can go away and correct me on that, I'm sure. But it's REST APIs are a relatively new thing. They weren't that popular for a long, long time. It was really mobile phones that made them popular, because much smaller data packets being sent around. Prior to that, everything was SOAP-based because we had strongly typed systems. So Salesforce were one of the first organizations that expose their items via an API so that they could start to separate their front end from their back end. And that's why they can do things like change from classic, as Barry and I would refer to it, to Aloha Classic, as we would all refer to it as classic, and then to Lightning. And let's be frank, in another 12 years' time, there'll be something else that comes along with another snazzy name that none of us will know about. But that's one of the things that Salesforce have done, and that's really important. It looks like Java. Okay, there's a reason that Salesforce did that. It's because it is Java. Under the hood, it's being compiled down to Java. It's a layering on top of Java. Okay, but it's not Java. It just looks like it. Okay, has anyone ever heard of the duck programming concept? You know, in that when you're working with a computer programming concept and trying to figure out, when you're doing reflective programming, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's likely to be a duck. Okay, it looks like Java, it walks like Java, it quacks like Java, but it isn't actually Java. And we'll see in a minute some differences between it. But again, there's a million Stack Overflow threads out there about why can't we have this aspect of Java or that aspect of Java? And it's because it's not actually Java. And the final piece I've highlighted here is what I think is actually the most important statement in this entire thread. Apex acts like a stored procedure. Now, one of the things that a lot of Salesforce developers don't realize, just through the way in which Salesforce is fantastic at abstracting it away, is that you're not really running against a regular database. You're running against an abstraction of a database, and we'll talk about that later on. But if you were to work with Microsoft SQL Server or Postgres or Access or MySQL or whatever flavor of SQL Server you wanted, there are these things called stored procedures. And that's what a trigger is like in Apex. It's this bit of code that runs anytime, excuse me, something saves. Now with stored procedures, you have to write them and you compile them and you save them and you deploy them and you do all these things. And they can actually be quite difficult to update and manage. Whereas with Apex, excuse me, Apex triggers are much easier to deploy and work with. And so this gets to the heart of what Apex is actually meant to do. Salesforce is a transactional system where all you're ever really doing is saying, save this data to the database, retrieve this data from the database. If you can come up with any action you do in Salesforce that is not retrieve this data from the database or save this data to the database, I'll be impressed, as I haven't yet found one that I can't curtail into that. But that's pretty much it. And because of that, Apex is built to run like stored procedures. It's built to do those quick transactions in and out. Get some data out for you or whack some data in for you and maybe manipulate it on the way. So because of all these things, Apex is actually a domain-specific language. So domain-specific language, or a DSL, was, you can see here the quote on the right is from Martin Fowler's book from 2010. And DSLs were a really big thing during kind of the 2010s, where everyone was trying to build them. And you'll have seen others like YAML started its life out as a DSL to kind of allow you to work on things. But if you've ever used if you ever worked with another programming tool where you can use this kind of faux language in the middle that isn't really a language, it's normally a markup language as well, and allows you to kind of set some rules and precedents of how things operate, but isn't really doing anything in the background and is extremely limited, that's a DSL. It's a domain-specific language. It's a language that only works in that domain. And that's what Apex is. It's only working on Salesforce servers in one instance. It's specific and has specific implementation details for the platform it was developed for. It is compiled down to another language. It's compiled down to Java bytecode in the background. And its primary focus is making the platform easier. And I chose this quote on the right specifically because if you read this, it could be a description of Apex. It's a computer programming language of limited expressiveness, so it's not as full-blown as Java or C# or anything else, focused on a particular domain, which is Salesforce. And so when we think about what Apex actually is, that's what Apex is. It's a domain-specific language that was designed before the idea of domain-specific languages really caught hold, to focus on allowing you to work with a Salesforce platform like stored procedures. The initial intent was really to help you provide a bit of logic on a page through Visualforce and allow you to work with triggers for stored procedures so that you could access and change the data. And that's really why it exists. So again, if we go back to our standard Salesforce transaction, step number one, someone sits there and works away and makes a request to a web page. They might change some data or do something or hit enter on the keyboard. It goes across the wire to the cloud. There's some processing done in the background. It gets saved. We send some data back across the wire and the user gets it updated, right? Everything we're doing is in that. If you're using Lightning experience or you're using, Lightning components, you're really just circumventing the early part of this, which is standard UI. Okay? Lightning components doing their own client-side stuff, you're still making changes and saving data to the standard transaction here. And that's what Apex is designed to do, is it's this bit here in the middle designed to say, retrieve your data or save your data. And one of the things it's designed to do that around is to abstract away that data model. So Salesforce's data model, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is an abstracted database. You're not really working against a database, you're working against an abstraction of a database. So under the hood, can anyone tell me what database Salesforce is under the hood that isn't Barry?
Oracle?
Oracle, correct. Yep. So under the hood, Salesforce is a huge Oracle database. And they used Oracle because the guys that were working at Salesforce originally were all ex-Oracle developers. So they understood it really, really well, and they knew how to come up with a scalable system around that. So what you can see here is from Salesforce's architect pages. So you go to architect.salesforce.com and have a look at the platform architecture page. You will see this, and this is what Salesforce actually looks like under the hood. And so when you're defining an object, what you're actually doing is you're inserting a record onto the objects table. Excuse me. And when you define a custom field, you're creating a record on the fields table and you're linking them. And then when you create a record of data, well, what it's doing is it's saying, this is the org that this data's for, this is the object it looks up to, and effectively, there's a long list of fields here, okay? And each field just has a number on there, just a number and a name, and that's it. And there's a mapping that's done between this empty fields table and this empty data table to say, on this record, where it's of type account, field number 123 is a date field and it's called birthday, okay? And that all goes on in the background. But this is incredible to think about. Just take a second to think about the complexity that's in here that Salesforce have got to allow you. So this started off because Salesforce wanted to make it easy for you to add fields, add objects, okay? For those who have worked with other database systems like Postgres, like I used to do a fair amount of work with Ruby on Rails. Anytime I wanted to add a new field onto a different database table, you had to define it, you had to deploy it, you then had to deploy it through all your environments, you then had to deal with all your breakages, you then had to worry about, do I have page views for it? Is it on the page layouts? Is it all set up? What's the security on it? What's everything else on it? Salesforce does all of this for you through this kind of extensible data model. But what Apex does for you is it abstracts it away, so you're not really worrying about it. You just sit there and say, I want an account. Well, there is no account anywhere. There isn't the concept of an account in a database. The account is just one of these records. Yeah? I want an invoice object, okay? It's just a record on that table. So what Apex is doing is it's actually abstracting all this stuff away. And between that understanding of it going away and helping us do those stored procedures, and acting as a stored procedure language on this very complex database setup, that's why Apex exists fundamentally, is to allow you to deal with a very abstract database structure in a way that's simple. Does that make sense to everyone? So with that in mind, let's talk about some of the things that are amazing about Apex. Okay, and there are some. So 5 awesome things. And for anyone who's not watched the Lego movie, please go and watch that straight away after this because it's worth watching. Apex gives you a dynamic object relational mapping system. Okay, so an object relational mapping system, or an ORM, is what will take a database and its tables and change it into objects. Okay, now in Java, it will create what are called POJOs, plain old Java objects. I think it's, is it Hibernate is, I think, the big one in Java, or Spring, or something like that. In .NET, it used to be NHibernate, I think it was, or something like that, or Rhino, or all of these different ones that would go in there. And what these libraries are doing, these big bits of code that you would spend hours on, or like Ruby on Rails is another one, would spend hours using, is going away and saying, which one of these libraries am I going to choose that's going to look at this database table and translate it into a set of objects and data and concepts that I can work with. Okay, Salesforce gives you that out of the box, but more importantly, it's dynamic. Okay, how much work do you need to do when you add a new object in to get it visible in Apex? None. It's there. How much work do you need to do when you add a field? None. It's there. Okay, it's really, really overly clever that it can do that just at the push of a button and get that in there for you. If you delete a field, it's even smart enough to tell you, can't delete that field, you're referencing it in here. Okay, it's a really powerful system to enable you to do that mapping between these things with never having to worry about it. It's also one of the big reasons that I'm, and this isn't the point of where we're going on this kind of conversation, but I'm not a big fan of like data mapping layers and things like that. There's a lot of people that use them where they have all their queries in one place and they extract it to a series of objects and do it. No, I don't like that. To me, that's really what Salesforce are providing me in it. I can see Barry nodding, which is always a good sign, but there's other people that really love those things. But yeah, Salesforce does all of this out of the box for you. And then to top it off, it makes it backwards compatible. So as it releases a new feature, you can immediately start using the new features in your new versions of the API, or you can keep your code running. I found code recently in an org from a customer that was running on version 17 of the API. Right, so that would be, we're on what, 55 now. So that is 30, 37, 38 versions back. So 3 versions a year. So we're on about 12, 13 years
12 years ago.
Yeah, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, right? It's a long time ago for a bit of code to still be running and be fine. Do you know what the funniest thing was? It was code from Salesforce, right? It was actually code from themselves working on communities and things like that. It's crazy that it works like that and works so well, but it does. And so backwards compatibility is a huge, huge thing that, we're very lucky we never have to deal with. Now, if you are doing dynamic Apex, so if you're writing dynamic SOQL and you kind of do that thing where you query for all the fields on an object, and then you run that, and then you write the query as a string, and then you run that, that's when you might get some issues if you have different Apex class versions, because a field might exist on one version of the API and not on the other. So again, another reason that, maybe not to go doing too many super dynamic selectors and things like that, but in general, no, you never have to worry about this. I bet you most developers in Salesforce never spend a moment thinking about API versions, other than occasionally updating them because they want to use a feature. It has built-in security and permissions. Now, again, really hard to overstate this, but when you're working with another language, you can retrieve all the data you want from the database. Doesn't mean anyone could see it or use it or should be able to use it. You then have this problem of what are you sharing, what are you showing, what are you not, what are you transferring over the wire? Again, if you're ever really interested, like have a look at some of the requests that come through from some of the websites you're using, your Facebooks, your Twitters and whatever, and see the data there compiling down and sending across and how to break it down in there. There's loads of people that have done these really interesting breakdowns for you. But Salesforce, it builds in all that security for you. You define it using permissions and profile sets, job's done, it's there. And with some of the new additions that have come in, the with security enforced, the user mode and things like that, making sure that you're using with sharing, it does everything for you in there. It's really, really powerful. But it's a simple thing that we sometimes take for granted. Performance is really repeatable. Okay, now I can probably tell there are a few people in here that's going to say it's not about performance, but performance on Salesforce is really, really repeatable. You are always going to be running against the same hardware again and again and again and again. So it will run in a repeatable, regular manner. You know that you're going to get a certain amount of resources. You know you're going to get a certain amount of governor limits, and you can be sure that if it runs on one server like that, it'll run on the others. I've done a fair amount of Heroku work over the years, and one of the best things that the Heroku team had on board was a bunch of really technical, clever people that when you were running certain applications, they would come in and they'd show you how to save a fortune on them. And what they would do is they would just profile the hell out of your application with you and say, if you did this, you could lower it all down, and you go from using one huge performance dyno to 3 lowercase dynos or whatever. And it's just by understanding what resources you're using on the CPU, but switching between those, upgrading your AWS tiers and things like that, it does massively impact the performance of your application. Whereas with Salesforce, it's going to run repeatedly, even when you're calling it from a mobile app or across, through an API call. And the final one is an embedded query language and framework. You don't have to learn a brand new SQL variant. There isn't actually options in the different SQL variants you get. There's nothing stopping you with different databases using a weird and wonderful SQL language on top if you wish to. Be a bit mad to, but you could do. SQL's built in. It knows all about it. It knows all about what fields you can and can't see. We've now got security enabled in that with security enforced. But SQL has this really powerful set of features like the aggregate features. The number of lines of code and hours I've saved just by using an aggregate feature properly is immense. It's fantastic. So all of these things just come baked in to Salesforce off the bat, and are just absolute lifesavers and just make Apex fantastic. Now with that, there's always another side. There are some things that are less than awesome about Apex. So broader testing options. Apex you can unit test, but we've all got complex processes where we know that we do A and then B and then C and then D and then E and then F. And they become very hard to test within that unit testing framework, especially if you're trying to coordinate things with like batch jobs or asynchronous jobs or things like that. It can become quite difficult to do that. It'd be good if we could do some broader integration testing rather than just unit testing, so that we could write some integration tests that would allow us to do that, or just allow us to do slightly more mocking, slightly more kind of different testing styles even, because doing true TDD on Salesforce is still quite tough. Broader reflection. I mentioned a minute ago the idea of duck programming, and if it walks, acts and quacks like a duck, it is a duck. But Salesforce, Apex in particular, is not great for reflection. You can know what type something is, and we can do some basic inheritance, but you can't call a method on a type using a string. You couldn't go and say, I'm going to create a class using this string name, and then I'm going to invoke this method on it using this string. You need to have some knowledge about what interface it's using at first. So things like that would really allow for far more dynamic programming, especially if you are thinking about running processes remotely as an ISV partner, for example. If you've got a package, you might want to enable yourself to do that. At the moment, you have to do it through exposing it via an API. Debugging. Anyone here love debugging on the platform? Yeah, it's one person. Stan loves debugging, and that's it. So, I mean, it is really tough, especially if you've got a managed package installed. You get nothing. You get an error message that tells you the error. You don't have permissions here, and then it just continues saying manage package. That's really tough to work with. You have to. I mean, now you can stream debug logs to the console. It's a bit easier in VS Code, but it'd still be good to put in, to be working through it and put in a breakpoint as you are running it live, or to be able to do a bit more information on there. So debugging is still tough, but especially with packages in there. A packaging framework in general. So when I say a packaging framework here, I mean something like a Yarn or an NPM or a Gems or something like that. One of the things that I think is really difficult as Salesforce developers is to work together, or to collaborate more broadly. One of the things that so fflib is a really popular library. I'm not a particular user of it or a fan of it myself, but fflib is a library that lots of people use. It has to be done as an unmanaged package, which then makes it hard to to maintain, to upgrade, to push new things, and to do bits like that, and to know dependencies. Everyone here uses a trigger framework. If they don't, go and get a trigger framework, something like Kevin O'Hara's. But it would be really good if you could go into an org and the first command you run is install trigger framework, blah, 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 and it will go and retrieve all the things that you need to do it. And I think there'd be a plethora of little libraries and toolkits that developers would be willing to write and share with each other just to help on that. And it's doable at the moment, but it's still not as easy as it would be if we could have something like Yarn with a bit of dependency management. And then lambdas. So for those who aren't aware, lambdas are kind of the idea of kind of pieces of code that you would write and define that aren't methods in themselves and that can be run at time as you want. So a good example is if you've done any Lightning Web Component work, when you get the response from a wire method, the promise that it returns is, well, it returns a promise, but you can then use Lambda functions or fat arrow functions, as they're often known, to kind of work through that. And lambdas are a nice way of doing a bit more kind of dynamic programming and would allow a bit more flexibility, I think. So they'd all be amazing, and they are in Java. But remember, it only looks like Java. It's not Java. So, you know, when we're asking for all these things, there's layers and layers of security to add on. And that's, again, one of the things to remember is that you don't ever update your Apex security. Like Salesforce makes sure that Apex is all secure and running for you. So I'm aware that I'm already sort of 43 minutes in and want to make sure there's some time for questions. So just want to talk about why you should learn Apex. Apex, I think, is still a really important skill on the platform. It will, if you are a declarative person, it will make you much better at Flow. It will make you better at database design, and it will also make you better at programming if you're a programmer. It will make you better at Flow because it will help you understand how to structure kind of programmatic processing, because Flow is just writing it to effectively Apex in the background anyway, or doing a similar process. If you start writing more Apex, it'll help you understand your database design and how you can really coordinate things in a better way to kind of manage your data and work with it. And it'll also just make you a better programmer, because if you are working with another language and move to Apex, it's a good transition, and the governor limits will make you really start to think about, do you need to loop through that thing another 10 times, or can you be a bit more restrictive? It is a growing and in-demand skill. If anyone on the call isn't aware that Salesforce is an in-demand area in the career ecosystem, and in IT spaces in general, then it is. You should be able to find yourself a developer job pretty well. But Apex is always going to be a growing area that your org will really help you. Thank you for it. I'm working with a client at the moment who have got a large Salesforce implementation with FSL and Service Cloud and Sales Cloud and Experiences and a bunch of stuff. And there's loads of things in Flow, and it's grown organically, and that's fine. That's how systems grow. It's an organization that when I first started working with them were 100 people, and now they're 500, and I've been working with them for 2 years. It's been rapid, but adding in, going in and just adding in more flow and processes on top, is never going to give you the ultimate optimal outcome. Writing code, if you write code in a non-stupid fashion, and the phrase non-stupid here is important because you can always write things that are slow if you really want to, you will always match the performance of Flow. You'll probably beat it a number of times as well, but you will always at least match the performance of Flow, and your org will always be better for it. Now, I'm not saying, and this is not saying you should get rid of all flows and put it all in code, but as you start doing more complex processes, and as you start seeing flows that start to build out and become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, Apex is the place to go, because you can start to coordinate the data flow a lot more granularly and really add a lot more structure in there. So again, it's not saying get rid of Flow, it's saying replace it when appropriate with Apex code, because it will be quicker and neater. As a case in point, we've got one series of flows that we had in that org, which we replaced with, it was a 45 node flow, and I replaced it with 10 lines of code. Okay, one of them is always going to be quicker, and I'd love to say it's because I'm some sort of super genius. It's not. It's because it was an old flow, and it was just starting to get more and more complex, and it just could be done a lot quicker and easier in code. And finally, like Apex is going to be the hub for the new connectivity and features, right? It's where new things will come first if they're going to be big areas. So data weave coming into Apex is a big thing. Okay, for those who aren't familiar, is anyone super familiar with data weave? We've got any MuleSoft people on the call, I suppose is a good question. No one played with MuleSoft before. So data weave is, and I'm going to get this wrong, I know, but data weave is the language that is used to allow you to write transformations on data in MuleSoft. And if there is a MuleSoft person that watches this later on and gets it and says I've got that wrong, please correct it in the comments below. But that's a high-level overview of data weave. Having the ability to call that within Apex is huge. Being able to pass sets of records in, transform them, and get the transformation back and move that on. It's a very, very interesting concept, and starts to bring that connectivity a lot more deep into the platform. And functions as well. I mean, I know that a lot of people probably haven't used functions either a lot or in anger. I know that there is a price tag on them at the moment, but most Salesforce products start off as fairly expensive when they're released, and then they'll come down in price as they get more and more adoption. I think functions will definitely do that, and I can see that being a bigger area. But those are the two big areas that are really coming in to Salesforce. And yeah, sort of being very honest, I'm starting to work on a second edition of the mastering book, and those are two features that I'm adding in there that weren't around 2 years ago. Big areas to add in. And so finally then, where might the Apex language go? So this slide is to say I don't have any secret information. I've not been sat there in the background. I mean, yeah, I do chat occasionally to Andy Fawcett and Chris Peterson and a few other people at Salesforce, but I'd love to tell you that they give me all the secret insider gossip, but I know nothing more than you do, okay? So this is pure speculation and hyperbole here, but it's based upon where things have been going. So things I think we're going to see more of. I think we've seen that there's been an increase on security in Apex, and I can only see that growing. It used to be that we had with sharing, and you could check on a field by field level or object by object level the permissions. And since then we've had strip inaccessible and with security enforced, and now we've got with user mode. And I can only see those features growing more over the time, especially as we start to add in things like perhaps audiences or things like that. Within Experience Cloud, I could see there maybe being an integration there that you could define an audience with Experience Cloud and then pass that audience information in or something, and it be put in there for it to run on. Similarly with content and pieces like that. So I think that there will be a bigger focus on security, and I think especially as Salesforce has grown and grown and grown and grown, this will be key for them to kind of maintain their position. And think about things like Slack. Slack integrating with Apex is a big area now. That wasn't even on my list a minute ago. So Slack and Apex integrations are going to be a big area. But how do you make sure that the person is meant to be able to see that data? If I'm in a Slack channel with Barry, and let's just say that I'm a service agent and Barry's a account executive, and Barry happens to post, call a function that posts in all the account details, I'm probably not meant to see, how much they've sold last year or what the current opportunities are on there or something like that. So I think we'll start to see more of that built in there as well to kind of allow that to be passed through in these contexts. Integrations. Okay, data weave's one on there. I just mentioned Slack as well. I think Apex is going to be the place where integrations will come in, because you can start to define integrations using external APIs, ones that match the kind of correct REST schemas or SOAP schemas if you're using what used to be outbound messaging, outbound messaging and things like that. But Apex is always going to be the place where you've got a bit of custom authentication you need to work on. You need to manipulate some data and send it over. Apex will be the place to make those callouts and get that response and do the JSON manipulation. And when you start to add in things like data weave as well, you can see some really interesting pieces coming up there. One of the things that I think is interesting to see is Slack and Apex integration to do messaging and pieces there, because I can see notifications being a big part going forward, that really the little chatter bell icon doesn't really do enough at the moment, whereas a Slack message is really going to grab your attention. And also kind of deeper integrations with things like what is now Tableau CRM, with Tableau itself. I mean, there's no integrations with Quip as far as I'm aware. Salesforce at some point have got to do something with that, so I can see just more and more of that coming in. Scalable additional resources for short burst work. There is a lot of edge cases that are now becoming less edgy, where you need to do something quickly at scale in Apex and get the result back, and are willing to pay for it. And this used to be the sort of thing where you'd ping it over to Heroku. You might make a REST call out with a bunch of data and ping it over to Heroku. I've worked on systems before where you would have it go over via Heroku Connect, and then you make an API call out, and it would then run it on a queue basis and send it back for you in kind of an RPC mode. There's all these different options that used to be there and out there, but I think functions are going to become a bigger and bigger part, especially given the volumes of data that people are now processing on Salesforce and things they're wanting to do. One of the big areas for me on Salesforce that's always been challenging is that there is no file system. If you want to do any sort of manipulation of binary data, so blobs, like if you're working on a CSV or anything, you have to do it in memory in Apex, and you get 6 megabytes if it's synchronous and 12 if it's asynchronous. That's fine and dandy, but you can't do anything with an image in there or anything like that. And so I think that functions may allow a way going forward for you to pay for boosted resources on there to do more intelligent things and more interesting things, rather than necessarily send it to AWS or to somewhere else to do it. And if you think about functions and platform events, you can end up with a really interesting scalable model of, someone signs up for a product, it fires off a platform event, and that will notify 5 or 6 different places, but one of those might be a function that will go away and do a bunch of data manipulation and setup for them to get them running, or do some image manipulation, whatever it might be, to kind of give them that short, quick, sharp burst. Salesforce CMS, I can see some improvements in the integration there. Salesforce CMS is a really interesting product at the moment, because I'm doing some implementations with it. I quite like it. I think it scales pretty well. But at the same token, I, for the life of me, can't figure out why they didn't just make it a special type of S object. We have big objects, we have external objects. I cannot fathom why they didn't just make it so that it was called _CMS. I was going to say C then, but that wouldn't work, would it? Something like that, just to allow it to be really scalable and flexible, so to kind of pull that down. And there would have been restrictions like you can't update it every 10 seconds and it's cached and things like that. But I'd have quite happily given that up. I think that as the current way of working with the CMS is through the Connect API, it's okay. It's not as easy to, you want it to really, there's no SOQL syntax on there is what I'm trying to get at. And the really interesting thing is with every other CMS out there, in the background, it's a database, okay? WordPress is a database. It runs against MySQL. Drupal runs against MySQL. All of these things run against a database in the background. So allowing something like that would, to me, seem to make sense. And I think there'll be deeper integration on the CMS front to allow for that. Packaging and DX improvements. Salesforce have really committed to that over the past 5 years. They've really kind of gone strong on improving that, and I can see them only doing that more and more. Things like, I look forward to the day when I can work on an iPad Pro and not have to have a laptop, because if I'm doing programming, if it's all in the cloud, why should I need a laptop to run it down in sync? I look forward to being able to run it all in the cloud, have it connect to a Git repository, and do all the kind of normal CI/CD stuff I want to do, all running there. And I think that Salesforce are going to work towards that. I think everywhere in the industry is working towards that, but I think for Salesforce, it really makes sense to be able to say, you don't need a laptop. You can work from anywhere. Much closer integration for Apex and Flow. obviously you can now call, you can now invoke invocable actions from Apex and things like that. I can just see those two coming closer and closer and closer to allow declarative developers the ability to use more Apex features, and allowing Apex developers to both test flow a bit more thoroughly, but also extend it out there for people to use. And when you start thinking about things like I'm saying with data weave and with functions and with Slack and things like that, that's where Apex can really provide that availability for things to integrate in a broader manner. And then finally is just improving asynchronous operations. I think we've got queuable, batchable, schedulable, future. We've now got platform events. We at some point are going to need to get a just better setup on having a way of managing and using asynchronous operations and processing them through. And I think that Salesforce will probably start to work on that as we go over the next few years to really kind of push that along. And so that's what I had. Oh, and general performance. I had another one I didn't even think of. General performance, I think it's one of those things that Salesforce is like any other platform. It's improving, it's growing as it goes. Hardware is getting faster. Salesforce will eventually start to use more of that, and I think that there'll be more general performance improvements as we go. And there was one recently around tests running faster because they'd enabled a feature. I can't remember what it was called in the background, but unit tests running a little bit quicker. So I can see a few more of those things occurring. And if you're running it and you get 10 seconds of CPU time, if the CPU is running faster, that means you can do a little bit more in your 10 seconds. And so that was it. So again, thank you very much for having me come here and give you my sort of 2 penneth worth on Apex, and hopefully you found it interesting and a little bit different to just looking at another screen of code. If you are interested in messaging me after this or have any questions or want to connect or whatever, P Battisson on Twitter. I'll probably try and grab that on Mastodon at some point, who knows. Same on LinkedIn. There is my YouTube channel there, and as I say, there are books and courses and things out there with my name on it. If you have bought one or have got one, thank you very much for supporting them. If not, never feel you need to look at them or buy them, but they're there if you have any interest. So thank you. Any questions or anything anyone would like to ask, discuss, or whatever? Need to close some loops and get a higher level view on Apex. Oh, you're welcome. I think one of the interesting things about Salesforce development is that it's the greatest ecosystem for seeing people come in from non-traditional backgrounds. So part of the reason that Barry and I have met and know each other is I used to be a Salesforce instructor, and I know Barry still does instructing, and it's really quite cool because on the courses you're teaching, when you're teaching Apex, you get, I don't know what it's like for you, Barry, and if it's still the same, but if you were teaching a 10-person course, you get 3 Java developers, 3 .NET developers, 1 person who'd done like PHP at some point, and then the other people would be like, I've sometimes felt like they've never touched a computer before, ever wanted to learn it.
Yeah, I did teach a course once and the guy sat at the front who seemed very knowledgeable and knew his stuff, very experienced, but all I'd ever done was SOAP API. He actually never logged into Salesforce before. So it was interesting teaching him Apex day one. And then I did teach another guy who actually had been coding Salesforce since 2006. He worked in Salesforce, complete expert. He wanted to pass an exam. So you get really weird people trying to get in, but a lot of people who join, myself included, I joined as a web developer. I wasn't actually really a backend coder at all. You get a lot of people joining who pick up the language pretty well.
Yeah, and this is it. So I think it's interesting to have this kind of conversation because for most people that come to Apex, it's either, it's definitely not taught at many universities, if any, like Java is, and you're either coming in as a developer who's from another language and therefore trying to get your head around what is this thing that's like Java but not like Java, or you're coming in from a declarative perspective where it's like, what is this? What does a strongly typed oriented object language mean? What is that? What does all this come together and do? So hopefully it's been useful for people to kind of make them or to share a few of those oddities around it.
Does anyone have any other questions for Paul? Well, as I said on the screen there, all of his contact details are there. If you look for Paul anywhere, Paul Battisson Salesforce. In fact, I think if you look for Paul Salesforce, you'll probably find him. That's fantastic, Paul. Thanks very much for the time and the presentation.
No, thank you. I'll share it with you as well, Barry, so you can upload it wherever you want. And yeah, thank you very much for having us and chatting to us and listening.
Yeah, and hopefully see you in person sometime soon.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, well, if we're ever at an event and you see me, please pop over and say hello. It's always good to bump into people in real life.
Absolutely. Okay, guys, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks very much, guys. If I don't see any of you, I'll see a lot of you before Christmas. We don't have a good break. We're back in January, hopefully, with a good event. I'll be talking to you, Jürgen, about doing something cool. But that's it, guys. Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers, all.
Thanks. That was very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye
Thank
now.
you, Barry.
Thank you all. Have a nice evening. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.